Okay, this is a video about baking bread, making bread from scratch. It's for those who have never made bread before and for those who have failed making bread one or more times. I've met a lot of people who have told me over the years, I've tried to make bread and I fail. I just can't do it. And there's probably one secret to not failing at making bread, because bread is very forgiving, especially if you have an easy recipe like I'm going to show you today. If you learn how to make this bread, then you can step up and make any kind of bread you want in your own kitchen. So we're going to learn a few basic techniques with a very simple recipe. I'm going to show you how to make it with the power mower first, if you will, and then after that I'll show you the old-fashioned way we'll make it by hand. So first of all, I'm going to talk about our ingredients. I've got flour here, and you have to make sure that you're using bread flour. Okay, this is very important because bread flour has more gluten than regular all-purpose flour, and the gluten is very important. It's what gives you the chew to bread. When making bread, we're using 4 basic ingredients. One is water, one is flour, one is salt, and the other one, the active one, is yeast. And again, I happen to be using this Fleischmann's active dry yeast. You'll read about proofing yeast in almost every recipe. I never do. And the reason I don't is twofold. One, they say put this in the refrigerator once it's opened. I put mine in the freezer. It'll last almost forever in the freezer. When I take it out, I scoop out a couple of spoonfuls and put it right back in the freezer again. So you can proof it if you want, and as a new baker you might want to proof it, or if you don't use the yeast very often, you should proof it. So in addition to the basic ingredients, you need one of these. 1995 at Bed Bath & Beyond or other places, this measures 8 inches across by 16 inches long, and it's a bread baking pan, basically. And there are other ways of raising the loaves, there are other ways of baking the loaves, but believe me, they're more expensive, they're more complicated. You raise the loaves in here, and you bake the loaves in here. What could be simpler? So you need one of those, 20 bucks, you need that. The other thing that you really ought to have is a pastry knife like this, but a spatula will do just as well, okay? Because we get a lot of stuff on the surface, and it makes it easy to get it up. Also, when we're turning our dough, working with it, it's nice to just get this under there and get a nice clean sweep. So that's really important. So here I'm using a granite countertop. Formica works just as well. And if you don't have Formica or granite, you've got an uneven surface like a tile surface with grout in it. Lay down a towel on that surface and take out your breadboard, lay the breadboard on top of the towel and butt it right up against the backsplash on your countertop. And then you can do your kneading and everything you need to do right on top of that breadboard. Now, here's the one secret to not killing your bread, okay? And if you follow this secret, it's almost impossible to fail. I know you can do it, but it's almost impossible to do it. You're really going to have to work at it. We're, as human beings, a temperature of about 98.6 or give and take. And this water, I can barely feel any warmth to it. Just barely feel that it's warm, so it's lukewarm. Here's the problem. When you read a bread recipe, for example, this recipe has no preservative. Usually to preserve bread, you use some kind of an oil-based product. You can use butter, you can use anything that has oil in it. Well, milk. So a lot of recipes call for milk and butter or margarine or something like that that you have to melt in the milk. So you put a pan on the stove, you heat up the milk enough to dissolve the butter or margarine or whatever you're using for the fat. And then people then throw it in their mixer, put the yeast in there, and immediately kill the yeast. You can almost hear the yeast screaming, "Ah, I'm dying." So what you want to do is, if you don't kill your yeast, it's almost impossible to ruin your bread. It's as simple as that. So you just want to barely feel, when you stick your finger in the water, you want to barely feel warmth, okay? do that, the yeast will love you, the bread will love you, and everything will turn out fine. So in this case, I'm going to proof the yeast. I don't normally do this, but just to show what it's all about, there's nothing to it. What we do, our recipe, I call it the 4-2 recipe. I'm using 2 cups of water. I'll be using 2 teaspoons of salt. I'll be using 2 teaspoons of our yeast and 2 teaspoons of a secret ingredient the secret I'll divulge in a minute, but we don't need it right now. Okay, so we take our 2 teaspoons of my 2 cups of water. We take our 2 teaspoons of yeast, and then I'll add a couple of tablespoons of flour, give or take, okay? And what's happening with the flour is feeding the yeast. I'll put a third one in just for the fun of it. So we've got yeast, we've got our water, put a little flour in there, and what's going to happen eventually is the yeast is going to prove that it's alive because it's going to start eating away at the flour, creating gas, which is what yeast does, and we'll see this kind of foam up. And we won't use it in the first batch, we'll use it in the second batch, the batch that I'm going to make by hand, okay? And now we're going to make batch number 1, and in batch number 1, I'm going to introduce my secret ingredient. And I call it a secret ingredient because it replaces what's normally called a starter, and in many bread recipes you're going to see a call for starter. Now there's several different types of starter. One starter, for example, is you can just do what I did there. You can take a little bit of yeast, you can take some water, you can put in some flour, make kind of a paste out of it, stick it in the refrigerator for a couple of days. Some people actually put it on their counter for a couple of days. Some people put it on the counter for a couple of days, leave it uncovered, or for a day, leave it uncovered, and it actually absorbs some other yeast that are in the air to give you kind of a local quality to your bread, I guess. I don't like to do that, but that's called a starter. Another starter technique is when you make bread, you can take kind of a small fistful of the dough and just stick that in the refrigerator. You can put it there for a week, and then add that back to your dough when you make it the next time. What happens there is it's kind of like cheese or kind of like wine. It develops flavor with time. And so you let it set over time, and the yeast and the flour and the water do their thing, and it develops a certain unique flavor. And there are different ways of making starters for all kinds of bread. So when you see a call for a starter, that's what it's all about. Because once you learn how to make this bread, you're probably going to get ambitious and want to get out a recipe book and make the others, and they'll call for starters. So that's what that's all about. Now in my case, this is easy to make and quick bread. And that's what I like, because if I have a starter, I have to think about making this bread on Wednesday evening, maybe Thursday evening. I have to take out my starter, or I have to make my starter. I have to play with it. I have to let it sit, blah, blah, blah. It's another big, kind of complicated step that I don't like to fool with. This stuff takes me about 45 minutes to make. It takes the bread about 5 hours to make, but the bread's doing most of the work. I'm only spending about 45 minutes on it. So I use my secret ingredient to cheat, and my secret ingredient is just basic honey, and I use 2 teaspoons of honey. Now you might think that's going to give the bread a sweet flavor, kind of a dessert type bread. It's not at all. It gives kind of a complex flavor to the bread. It also feeds the yeast as the yeast is working, the sugar does. So call it a secret ingredient if you want. It's my starter. There are 2 ways to make this bread. One is easy. If you've got a contraption like this, a strong enough mixer that a bread hook will work in it, okay? If you do it this way, it takes all the labor out of it, takes very little time, it's very easy to do, so away we'll go. There's only one word of caution here about this recipe. I actually taught a class at a cooking store one time, and there were several people in the class, and they became freaked out about the fact that my recipe doesn't tell you how much flour to use. The recipe is basically 4 2s and then flour. So we have our 2 cups of lukewarm water. Don't forget lukewarm, don't kill your yeast. And then on top of that, we're going to put 2 teaspoons of yeast. And then we're going to forget about our 2s for a few minutes. And we're going to add some flour to this. And this is what really freaks them out. They start putting the flour in, they say, oh, he doesn't tell us how much flour he's using. But the answer to that problem is that the dough is going to tell you when it's got enough flour. Whether you make it by hand or you make it with a machine like this, the dough is going to tell you when it's ready. It's just that simple. And so what I'm doing is I'm just letting this beater mix this a little bit. We'll put in a little more flour. And what we're doing is we're going to try and get this to a kind of a creamy consistency so that it will come off of the beater pretty easily with a spatula. We've got 2 of our 2s in there. We've got 2 cups of water, and we've got 2 teaspoons of our yeast. And now we can add 2 teaspoons of honey. And when I do it at home, this would freak people out too, but when I do it at home, I just do it like this. 1 teaspoon, but just to show you that I can use a teaspoon. There's my 2nd teaspoon. Point of the story is, I told you before, and I'll tell you again and again and again, bread is very forgiving. So if I've got 2 1/4 teaspoons in there, the bread doesn't care, I don't care. If I got 1 3/4 teaspoons in there, the bread doesn't care, I don't care. The bread might be different each time, but it's still going to be awfully good. So we'll let that work while I wash my finger off. Okay, you can see that that has kind of a creamy texture to it. And now we have our last 2, and that's 2 teaspoons of salt. And I use kosher salt. Now the reason I do is I've read somewhere, I don't know whether it's true or not, but I read somewhere that if you use regular table salt is iodized, it has iodine in it, and that the iodine can affect the flavor of your bread. I don't know whether that's true or not, but why take chances? I mean, kosher salt's readily available, and it always worked for me in the past, so I'm sticking with a good thing. Okay, now that's almost to the point where I don't dare put in any more bread or I'll never be able to get that beater clean. So from now on, I'm going to use the dough hook. So let that mix just a little bit more. Get it as creamy as I can get it. And then take that out. And we'll clean off this guy. Get rid of him because we'll be done with him. I'm going to throw in a little more flour. Start to get a little careful at this point, but not too careful yet. Now, in this mixer, if you turn it on high, it's going to get flour all over the place. So I set it on a low setting until it incorporates some of the flour. And then once it does, I can turn it up a bit. I'm going to get it down away from the sides. And turn it up a little bit more. Now we're kneading the bread, or the machine's kneading the bread. It's saving us an awful lot of labor, an awful lot of work. Now you can see how sticky that is in there, so obviously it needs more flour. So let's add another one of these, because it's still pretty sticky. Again on low so it doesn't go all over the room. help it out a little here. Now it's beginning to look a little bit like dough. It's not quite there yet, but it's getting better looking. Now this is kind of important. If you look down at the bottom of the pan, you can see that the dough is pulling away from the bottom of the pan, and then all of a sudden, bloop, it goes back again. That tells me it's not done yet, but it's getting closer. So I'm going to be a little more careful with the amount of flour that I add. What we're looking for here is we're looking for this dough to completely clean the bottom of this mixing bowl. Might do it this time, might not. We'll see. Again, we start slowly. Pick it up a little bit. And now really pick it up. You can see the dough is pulling away from the sides, and it's also cleaning the bottom of the bowl. But we're going to let it run a little bit more because it may be trying to fool us. Sometimes when you let it run a little bit more, it'll start sticking at the bottom again. And that's exactly what's happening now. So we're going to just add a tiny little bit more flour. And at this point, I like to take the dough away from the dough hook. This is just a personal preference of mine, but I like to take it away from the dough hook, throw the flour on it so that it gets all around the bread. And I think that's probably going to be enough flour. Okay, now this time I think what you'll see is when I crank this thing up, it's going to really clean the bottom of the bowl, and the bottom of the bowl is going to stay clean no matter how long I let it run. See how nice and clean the bottom of that bowl is now? That told me that that dough is done. It's all ready. Okay, so we're quit. And that's it. Now you can see that it's still pretty sticky, and I'm going to show you something here that's kind of important when you make it by hand, okay? So we put some flour down, and we just come over here, pour this out on our floured surface. Come on, get out of there. And I'm going to show you what perfectly kneaded dough looks like. And this is ultra important. I just put a little flour around so that I can handle it better. But what you're going to see, I'll knead it just a little bit to get that flour off the surface. And what you're going to see is that looks really smooth, okay? Not quite as smooth as a baby's bottom, but it looks pretty darn smooth. It has a pliability to it, okay? And that's what good kneaded bread looks like. And the interesting thing is, with just that little addition of flour on the surface, I can handle this perfectly, okay? Even though it's a very, very sticky dough. So this is a test that you'll read about in several recipes for bread to see if it's perfectly kneaded. We take our hand, lay it on top, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Pick up my hand, there's no flour on it, no stickiness at all. That's perfectly kneaded bread. We'll take that now, put it in a bowl, put the lid back on to cover it up. We'll let it sit at room temperature for 2 hours, and it'll at least double in volume in that time. And we put it in a draft-free area because drafts have a tendency to drop the temperature. So we want this thing to sit at room temperature for 2 hours. If I can get that to work. Okay. So there's our yeast, and you can see that it's bubbling up, and it's proofed itself. It's proved to us that it's alive. And we're going to take that. We've already put in our 2 cups of water. We've put in our 2 teaspoons of yeast, so that's 2 of the 4 twos. And we've got some flour in there, but who cares? So we're going to just take that now, put it in a bowl. So now we've got our water and our yeast. To that, we're going to add some flour. And this time we have to use human power because we don't have any machine working on this. But we're going to just basically mix it up like we did before. So we just stir that, get the lumps out. And what we want to do now, if you take this out too soon, you're going to have one sticky mess on your hands. And so what we want to do right now is work in the bowl as long as we possibly can, just like we did in the mixer, okay? So I'm mixing this up, getting it to kind of a liquidy consistency. And then we're going to do what we did before. We're going to go to our third two, okay, when it comes to ingredients. And that third two was the honey, or starter, if you will, if you'll forgive me for that. And we'll put in 1 teaspoon, another teaspoon, get out of there. Clean up my finger and mix that up. Put in a little more flour. Stir that a little bit. Whoops, and then we'll add our last two. So we have 2 cups of water. We have 2 teaspoons of yeast. We have 2 teaspoons of our starter or our honey. And now we have the salt. Now in baking, there are 2 kinds of people. Actually with the salt, I'm just a little shy of the 2. You can put 2 in if you want. I put 1 and just a shy other one. But there are 2 kinds of people that bake bread. There are those who have forgotten to put the salt in, and then you get unleavened bread, which isn't all that great. And then there are those people who have yet not forgotten to put the salt in. I've done it, my daughter's done it. So what I do always, and I should have shown you this when we did the machine version of this, but what I do always is when I take the bowl for cleaning, after I've made my dough, the last thing I do is take a pinch and taste it for salt. Make sure I put the salt in, because it's really easy for some reason to forget the salt. Can't tell you why, but I've seen a lot of people do it. So now this is getting really hard to stir, and so now I got to get my hands all dirty, because I think this is about as much as I'm going to get in there with this spoon. You can see that there's still some down in there. We'll get that out when we dump this out. So let's get some flour, put it on the surface, put some on our hands. That's kind of important. And then we'll dump this stuff right on our surface and go to work. And then I'm going to show you a tip about kneading. Again, it's not the classical style of kneading, but kneading dough can be an awful lot of work. And over the years, I've discovered kind of a shortcut. Now, what they tell you in classic kneading of dough is you fold the dough over and you push. You fold the dough over and you push. What I find is much easier is I fold the dough over and I drop down. Now what I'm doing is I'm using my weight, and there's no work at all. Now this bread is starting to come together. Still very, very sticky, but I'm getting to the point, you see, where I don't have to add quite as much flour to knead it as I did when we started. So a little more flour here, a little more flour here. Fall on it. Fall on it. Fall on it. Okay, getting sticky again. A little more flour. Flour in my hands. And what we're looking for, if you remember, from when we made it by the machine, is we're looking to get this to the point where we can put our hand on it, and my hand's not going to stick to it. If I tried it now, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. I got dough that just came away on my hand. You can see it puckered there. So clearly, this isn't ready yet, but it's getting very close. Now, when we made the bread with the machine, I told you I used my first 15 minutes. Well, when we're making it this way, we're probably going to easily add another 10 minutes to the process, but it's not that much longer. It's just a lot more work. So if you have the machine, or you can have access to the machine, boy, it makes life a lot easier. If you don't, then you have to do it the old-fashioned way. Okay, so we'll try our hand trick one more time. Very, very close. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. You see how it puckered up there? So it's not quite ready yet. So we'll add a little more flour here, a little more flour here. And that could be it. That could get us real close. So fall on it. Fall on it. You notice I'm really not folding in half. I'm just kind of tipping the end up and then just falling on it. And folks, I'm going to say that that's about done. The surface is pretty smooth, not quite as smooth as I had when I took it out of the machine, but it's getting there. Well, it's still a little sticky, so we're going to add a little bit more. I want to get this right. But you can see how the surface is smoothing out for me, and I'm getting that pliability that I showed you before from the machine. Part of what happens, the reason I don't get as smooth a surface when I'm doing it by hand, is because I've got an unsmooth surface here. And if I clean that up a little bit, this is probably going to smooth out on me a little bit. But this is ready. It's got very much the feel that the other did. It's got pretty much the look that the other did. And I'm just going to take a little tiny bit of flour, like I did before, dust this a little bit. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. No pucker. It's just nice and smooth. So we're done. One final step. We check for salt. Pinch. Taste. We're done. That's ready to go. So we'll put this in a bowl, just like we did with that, and cover it up. And we'll be ready to go. Okay, so we set our dough in the bowl and we let it rise for a couple of hours. And you can see it's risen a couple of hours and it's very sticky, okay? What we'll do now is we'll just get this away from the bowl a little bit. Flour the surface with plenty of flour because we're going to need it. And just dump this stuff right on the counter. You can see it's plenty gooey, but that's okay. Put a little flour on there, plenty of flour, flour on my hands, plenty of flour. And what we're going to do is we're going to knead it one more time. Now, I thought I was a genius. I thought I really discovered something one day because I forgot to put the salt in the bread. And so I got to this point and I thought, oh Lord, I forgot the salt. So what I did is at this point, I just put the salt in the bread. And of course I had to knead it in before I made my loaves. And I noticed that the bread had a much better bite to it for some reason. I don't know why, but I found that out by accident. Thought I was a genius, and I was teaching somebody to make bread one time. He said, oh, my grandmother does that all the time. So obviously I'm not the genius. I just stumbled onto something here good. So you do this just a little bit and put it back in the bowl. And we'll let that rest for about 15 minutes. And the resting will make it a lot easier to work with. If I tried to make loaves out of that now, it'd be too stiff. So we'll cover this up again, let it sit for about 15 minutes, and we'll be ready to make loaves. So we've punched down the dough, and we kneaded it again, and we let it rise about 15 minutes so it's easy to work with. And we just flour the counter again, and throw our dough back down on the counter. Cover it again with some flour so we can handle it. And we take a pastry knife and we cut it in two. Those are our two loaves. And then the next step is, I like to put a little flour on that end because otherwise it gets too sticky and hard to work with. Next step is we flatten it out. Now you can use a rolling pin for this if you like. I just prefer to play around with it with my hands, and you'll hear some popping and see some bubbles pop. And I like to get a lot of that stuff out of my bread because it gets a kind of a consistency to the loaf if I don't have big bubbles in it. So what I've done is I've got the square part here, that part that came from my cut. It's facing me. Spread this around a little bit, got rid of some bubbles, and now we take this end and we fold it in. We take our fingers and push that end down into the dough. Come back again, do it again. Push her down into the dough. Back again. And then what we're left with is this tail hanging out here. And we just take our fingers and we pinch that tail into a seam. Okay? You notice here at the end I'm kind of scrunching it all up, and otherwise you wind up with a kind of a ragged tail like that, and we don't want that. So pinch, 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 squeeze the ends. And here's kind of the fun part, for me anyhow. The loaf has to fit in here, and you can see that it's really not long enough. So what we do is flour our surface again, got some flour on the bread. We just take our hands in the middle and we just roll it and pull our hands out to the side. And that makes our loaf elongate. It's as simple as that. Okay? Now you can see it's going to pretty well fit right in there. Got way too much flour on that, so what we're going to do is just get rid of that flour. Don't need all that. And you'll notice that my seam is here, and so the seam doesn't break apart when we put it in the form. We put it seam side down, okay? Just like that. There you go. The next step is to take a very sharp knife and just put little vents in there. Now, it cuts down about 1/8 of an inch maybe. If you get more than that, who cares? If you get less than that, who cares? 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so they're ready to rise. So we'll take a kitchen towel, cover these guys up, and just set them aside. And they'll sit for about an hour and a half. And we'll take a look at them. And what we'll be looking for specifically is for them to have risen enough to just about be flowing over this edge. That's when they're ready. We want to look at them before that so we can set our oven. We set our oven to 425, and when these things have about doubled in size, then we'll stick them in the oven. It's as simple as that. So we preheated our oven to 450 degrees. I'm using the lower oven. I'm lucky enough to have two of them. And this one works better for bread than that one because it's more accurate. When you're baking bread, you have to learn about your tools and you have to figure out how your tools work. So your oven might say 450. It might be 425. What I'm doing right now is I'm just putting some water in the oven. The bread's been sitting here, rising. You can see it's just about to go over the edge. And that's what you want to know. You want to be able to see the bread just risen enough to just about go over the edges of this pan. Just stick the bread in there and set your timer to 12 minutes. And wait for the dinger to go off. Okay, so the timer's on or off. Turn her off. And that first baking at 450 is to brown the bread. And you'll notice that we've got a nice little browning on it now and a nice little bit of crust forming. So now we're going to just go to the bake setting, and the bake setting now is bake 325. And let's leave that in for about 14 minutes, okay? So timer 1400. It's got 14 minutes to do its thing, and then we'll check it with a thermometer. Okay, so the timer's gone off. I've got an oven thermometer here. And what I'm wanting is to see that this thermometer quickly goes to 200. So I set the thermometer in there with the 200 up because I'm going to be looking through the glass, okay? So we take the thermometer, let the steam come out of the oven, punch into the bread. So the thermometer's coming up now slowly to 200, past 180 pretty quickly, but going slowly to 200. So that means the bread needs maybe 2 or 3 more minutes, okay? So we'll just pull the thermometer out and set our timer again. So we got about a half a minute to go. You can use your thermometer again and test the bread again. Experience tells me that 3 minutes is going to make perfect bread. So I'm not going to bother putting the thermometer back in there. But if you want, put your thermometer back in there and make sure that that needle goes right up to 200 real quickly. And your bread is done. So here we go. We got about 5 seconds to go, and out comes the bread. Okay, timer's off. Put our mitts on. Pull our beautifully golden baked bread out of the oven. And I like to set it on a trivet like that. I find that with this particular baking pan, if I set it right on the counter, first of all, if you have a Formica counter, it's going to burn it. But I find that if I set it right on the counter, it seems to get moist underneath. Can't tell you why. Another thing that I do at this point in time is I just take the bread and make sure it separates. If you let it sit there and it does get a little bit moist, then it's not going to separate as well. You're going to leave some bread stuck down on the bottom. You'll notice that I left the water in the oven through the 450 and the 325 baking series. The reason I did that is because my wife doesn't particularly like very hard crust. This sounds hard right now, but it'll soften up as the bread finishes baking. If you like a real hard crust, the best way to get that is take the water pan out of the oven, when you set the oven to 325. And that'll give you a little bit harder crust, a little crunchier crust when the bread is finished. Now, the interesting thing is the bread has come out of the oven, but it's still baking. And some people like to take a very hot piece of bread and chop through there and put butter on it and have it, and that's good if you want to do that. But I like to let my bread go down to the point where it's almost cool. My wife loves a piece of bread that still has a little warmth in it, slather it with butter. You can do that, but don't forget, the bread is still working, and it will work all the way down to the point where it's at room temperature. So that's it, that's your bread. One final thing about this particular bread is that I mentioned before it has no oil in it, no preservative. That's basically what the oil does, the milk or the butter or whatever. And so how do you keep this? Well, I mentioned that I could make it, it started at noon, it'd be done at 5, we can have it for dinner. But what's left over, I immediately chop into sections about so long. You can chop it in any size you want, but a section about this long makes 3-4 pieces for 2 people for dinner. Double wrap it in, in saran wrap, number 1, and then put it inside a Ziploc bag and freeze it. That'll preserve it. That's the best preservative in the world. And interestingly enough, when you take it out of the freezer, stick it in a microwave to defrost it, it tastes like fresh bread. So that's the way you preserve this bread.